Some of these stories may contain subject matter that some viewers may find disturbing, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a story you would like to send my way, go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. Whenever I was 18, I met this girl in an online game that lived in a different state, about 17 hours away. We talked for months about anything and everything, and got to know each other and became really good friends. We shared pictures and even video chatted, so we knew that we were the real person in the pictures. After a while, it became more than just a friendship, and we gave long-distance dating a try. We promised each other that after we graduated, we would save up money and fly to be together in person. At the time, I'd been working with my dad at a shop that he owned part-time while I was still in school. Then, instead of finding another job, I decided I would start working there full-time to save up more money. When you don't have to drive to work and still live with your parents, you tend to have some extra spending money. I was thankful that they let me stick around, though. So, after a few months, I bought a ticket and I flew out to see her. It was definitely nerve-wracking at first, not seeing this person before, but it was a lot of fun. We did a lot of things, like going to the movies. She suggested some of her favorite restaurants and parks, and we got to play the same game together, next to each other where we first met. I was there for about a week, but I loved it there. I loved the area, I loved the neighborhood, I loved the weather. It was late summer, early autumn, and it wasn't hot or humid like it was where I lived. I also fell even harder for her, so, as some young people in love do, we started making plans for me to move there. She was currently living with her mom, so we could both save up money to get a place of our own. After I went home, we started looking for places to apply and move to, and started saving for the fees, deposits, and moving expenses. Now, I did have some belongings that I of course wanted to bring with me, as well as a car, so flying was going to be out of the question at the time. It took us a little longer than we wanted it to, but we had some things come up and halt our process. But then we were finally ready to sign for the move in the next spring. So it was my turn to pack up all my stuff and drive out there to start my life. I also figured once there, I could look for a job and maybe even go to college or something if I found something that I wanted to pursue. Now, of course, I'm 19, almost 20, full of excitement and love, and thought, sure, I'll be tired when I get there, but I could totally drive the 17 or so hours in one sitting and be fine. So I packed up my car and went to bed early the night before. I got up and had some coffee with my parents. Mom was still a little hesitant and worried about me going alone, but my dad was pretty happy for me. I grabbed some things to eat and energy drinks the day before as well, so I gave my parents hugs goodbye and I headed out. Finally, I was on the road and felt really good about myself and my future. I had music blasting. Katie called me a few times to see how I was doing, and I helped myself to some snacks to keep me going. I was definitely a little overconfident, though. This was the first time I had driven by myself longer than an hour, and I didn't really know how to pace myself. I also had trouble sleeping that night as I was so excited and nervous, so I ended up sleeping in longer than I wanted to, and also got held up talking to my parents, so I left later than I wanted. I was about 12 hours in, and I was starting to feel it. I could feel my eyes getting heavy, It was already dark, and I was on a long stretch of highway that didn't have any exits coming up soon. I called Katie to talk to her for a bit, even though I shouldn't talk on the phone while I was driving, but it was at least keeping me awake. She convinced me to stop and sleep, though, just to make sure I was okay and didn't get into any accidents. So I did end up speaking to her until I found an exit that literally only had a gas station on the sign. I said I was just going to pull into that parking lot and sleep there for a few hours. Then I would get back on the road. So we said goodnight, and I made my way to the gas station. I followed the arrow to the right from the exit, like the sign said, but there was no gas station. I ended up finding a gravel path that led to just a concrete slab in a small shack-like building. There was no pump or any sign of one. The dilapidated building had a white sign that went across the top, but there was no text. It looked like this was once a gas station, or maybe just a convenience store, but it definitely wasn't at this point. While it looked a little creepy, I was too tired to care, so I got out to relieve myself before I went to sleep and then got back into my car. But as I was lying there, preparing to doze off, I got a strong smell of sulfur. It was just weird being where I was, so I got up and looked around, and I didn't see anything. I wasn't the smartest at the time, but since I didn't immediately see anything and didn't care to check the building, I just made sure my doors were locked, tried to ignore the smell, and went back to sleep. I don't think I ever went into a deep sleep, or the dreams were very surreal because I started hearing what sounded like someone rubbing against my car, like running their hand and nails along the side of it. I opened my eyes, and I continued to stare at the roof of my car, trying to process what was happening. And that's when I started hearing whispering. I couldn't make out what was being said, or if it was even words or English for that matter, but I again sat there listening, not knowing what to do. But when I began hearing them pull on the passenger side door handle, that's when I sat up really quick. I looked over at the passenger door and didn't see anything. The whispering, the noises, it all stopped. I was pretty much parked parallel to the building, so I looked over to see if someone may have ran in there to hide, but I didn't see anything. Again, I was stupid and tired at the time and feeling like I could take on anyone that had the gall to mess with someone's car while they were in it. I decided to check it out and confront them. Don't worry, I still regret it to this day. The front of it just had a small door with a window that was almost impossible to see through. I could, however, make out a small counter and shelves along the back. I tried to reach for the door and, to my surprise, it was unlocked. I started to slowly pull it open when I heard a blood-curdling scream come from inside. I looked up just to see someone completely naked and nearly skin and bone run from the right side and jump and tumble over to the other side of the counter. I let go of the door and immediately ran back to my car. I locked the door, staring at the building to see if anyone would run over to my car, when I heard a banging on my hatchback. I looked back to see another, or maybe the same, man trying to climb on top of my car. My thought was, I was in the middle of nowhere. No one knows really where I am, so if anything happens to me, what the hell was I supposed to do? So, with only a couple hours of sleep, I started my car and burned out of the parking lot, watching the guy kind of tumble backwards away from my car. I got on the road and I was shaking, trying to start the navigation back up, but not wanting to stop. I finally got it started and I just drove the rest of the way fully awake. I was terrified they might try to come after me. There weren't any cars around from what I remember, but I didn't know if there was somebody waiting or what. When the sun was finally peeking up, I called Katie and told her that I was already back on the road, and that I was a few hours out. I think she could tell that something was wrong, so I pulled over to explain what had happened. She was trying to assure me that it was probably just a homeless person that had taken over the place, and I probably spooked them too. It made sense to me at the time, so I calmed down. I found an open gas station to stop and got some more coffee and tried to get a hold of myself. She had me send her my location, so she at least knew where I was. Something we probably should have done in the first place. And then I left again. By the way, being able to send your coordinates to someone via text is an absolutely incredible tool and very good safety measure. Anyways, I finally got there with no further issues or scares, and after having lunch, I slept for the rest of the day. The kicker, though, was the next day when Katie told me that I actually wasn't too far from an asylum of some sort. It was on the same road, but probably a few miles up. So, I may have come into contact with the patient that somehow got loose, maybe? I'll never know because I never went back to look for them. It was just an all-around unpleasant experience, and I wouldn't suggest driving alone at night in some unknown area outside of civilization to anyone. Back in the late 2000s, me and my then boyfriend Omar were taking an impromptu road trip. And we just wanted to get away, so we just set off heading east in whatever direction we were pulled, and stopped at places we were drawn to. We didn't have a lot of money, so we slept in our car a lot, which was fine, as it gave us more time to look around at places to go. However, our idea of places to go also included urban exploring. It was fun enough finding places local to explore, but even better when out of state. Places you've never been to or heard anything of, and just going in blind. We were driving through Mississippi at the time when our car started having issues and overheating. Thankfully, we were near an exit, so we got off the freeway and, with our hazards on, slowly drove into the closest parking lot and turned the car off. We had to figure out what was wrong with our car, and most likely without moving it, so we got directions to a nearby gas station and started walking. I was so incredibly thankful it was September, so it wasn't very hot. On our way there, we noticed what looked like this big old house with a fenced-in yard, until we started looking at it more. It was actually an old church that looked like it had been closed or abandoned for a while. At that moment, we could read each other's minds. We knew we were going to be staying in this little town for the night. We got to the gas station where they thankfully sold antifreeze and started our walk back. On our way, we looked around to see if there was anyone watching. We checked for no trespassing signs and looked for the best way in. However, the best way in would turn out to be the front gate. It didn't have a lock or a sign on it. Once we got back to the car, we poured in the antifreeze, and thankfully that seemed to help. We decided to eat while we were there, and then left to find a good place to leave the car while we went exploring. Turns out, there was a small motel not far off from the church, so we agreed to park it there. It was already evening when we first pulled into that first parking lot, so we didn't have to wait much longer until it got dark. Once we were good and didn't see anyone loitering around the motel, I emptied my purse, so all that I had on me was my pepper spray and a flashlight, and we left. As we walked to the church, we opened the gate and quickly ran up to the door to get in. The door looked like someone did a poor attempt at boarding it up, but missed one whole side of the frame as we could slip through and inside easily. Once in, I immediately noticed how creepy the main hall was. There was spray paint on the walls that said welcome. It looked like someone had taken the boards that covered the windows and made a sign that, again, said something like, "She welcomes all here." It was weird, but probably people that snuck in trying to make a church creepier than it already was. We walked over to the right that had a couple of rooms. It looked like it was for children based on the decorations and the bright colored paint that was peeling from the wall. The first room seemed to have a really old TV in it, but the actual center of it was busted out. There were a few toys in a small chest in the back as well, as a little cubby shelf with different names on it. Don't get me wrong, I love doing this, but seeing places like this with a name attached to it, it gives me a weird feeling. It makes it more real or brings it back to life, in a sense. I proceeded down to the next room, which was when things started getting weird. The room had been stripped. The cubbies and shelves on the wall had been all ripped out. The light fixtures and wiring seemed completely gone. The carpet had started being ripped up where it could be, leaving the bare wooden flooring underneath. But the creepy part was in the middle of the room. There was a pile of toys, or rather things. More specifically, it looked like anything with a face. Dolls, cars with faces, VHS tapes with faces on them, the clock with literal hands in it and eyes, all anything you could really think of. However, it was all red. It looked like someone had poured buckets of red paint on this stuff and then just left it. I thought that once again it was just someone trying to be creepy, so I just left it. As Omar and I started walking to check out the other side, we could smell something that was like an incense or a candle. Going further in the hallway, though, we couldn't smell it, and we definitely couldn't smell it on the other side either. Curious to know what it was, though, we decided to go to the only other place left, which appeared to be the main chapel area. We slowly creaked the doors open and went in cautiously. This is where we became a little more on alert. At the altar, we could see what looked like lit candles. Omar was hesitant to continue at first, worried that someone could be in here, but it wasn't that big and I couldn't see anyone from where I was. So, we agreed to walk further in together. As we did, I started to notice weird symbols on the walls, and they appeared to be written in the red paint, just like the room that we first saw. Omar then pointed at the pews that also had the symbols all over them. I was starting to get some weird vibes from this place at this point. I had never seen these symbols before. I was far from being well versed in different religions, but these all seemed more cryptic. However, the altar is where I waved the flag. From the entrance, I could see the candles but couldn't really make out anything else up there. Once we approached it, there was a pew that was up there but still facing the same way. I was startled at first because there was a tarp over it, and it looked like someone was underneath it. Omar softly kicked the pew to see if whatever was under there would budge. When nothing happened, he slowly pulled the tarp back. I almost got sick. It looked like a pig that had been dead for a very long time, which explained why we couldn't really smell anything. The podium, though, had a disturbing framed picture on it. It was a naked woman that looked like she'd had a long cut from her neck to her belly button. She looked like she was sitting on one of these pews, legs straight down and crossed at the ankles, and arms stretched out across the back rest. However, she was alive and smiling. The podium also had what we were smelling. It was an incense that was almost out, and the candles that we saw were those fake battery-powered ones. At this point, we were on edge. This meant that someone had to have been there fairly recently. Omar didn't want to stick around anymore, and I certainly didn't want to get to know anyone that did this, so we bounced. We quickly, and as quietly as we could, went right back out the front door. Omar had me go out the door first, and when I turned back to hold the board open some, I noticed he was looking to the left. I told him to come on when he finally walked out and pushed me towards the gate. Once we got out, we took off to our car, and when I thought we were just going to chill for a bit, he actually drove off. He said he would feel more comfortable if we got away from there. He didn't talk much while he was driving, so I did a lot of the talking, trying to just make jokes about what we saw to lighten the mood. I think we went a few more exits before we ended up at another hotel. After we slept that night and headed off the next morning, it was at that time that he finally told me what was wrong. He thought he had heard a noise when we were leaving, and when he looked over, he saw a man in a dark blue parka-looking thing holding a huge knife. He was just watching us leave. He wasn't comfortable staying there in case they came looking for us, so that's why we left. He hadn't said anything to me because he didn't want me to worry. I was okay with that too. I felt bad that he had to carry that on his own, but I'm thankful that he was watching out for us. We still like to do this, and it hasn't stopped us, but if we see anything even remotely off, it's not worth the risk, so we leave. And thankfully, we haven't run into any more pigs since. I used to work for a company that did a lot of survey work out in the woods and national forest areas. Basically, we were paid to walk the trails, take pictures of everything around, and report anything we find back to the park services. It may seem like a really weird and pointless job, but it's more about trying to determine if we have people coming out and using the land for things they shouldn't, camping in parts of the forest that are considered off-limits, and also to survey the wildlife. Sometimes we get migratory animals that make nests in part of the trails that are fully open to the public, and if that happens, we have to shut that part of the trail off, as it is a felony to disturb them. It's one of those positions that most people really don't even know exists, and it's probably one of the most important ones for the park services in my area. Now, doing this job was mostly uneventful. It was a pretty by-the-book kind of position, where I just had to determine what information was relevant, irrelevant, and write out the reports with the photographs. That may upset some people. A lot of people out there seem to believe that being out in the national parks all day every day must be super exciting and eventful. It's not. Go walk around in the woods for a full day, and then multiply what you see by 5, and that's pretty much a normal week for us. And that said, we did see some weird stuff sometimes. A lot of the time, we would just see homeless people trying to set up small gatherings in places they weren't allowed to, or drug addicts getting lost on the trails after a bad trip. Sometimes we would find things that were a bit odd, but again, it was mostly tame. I actually have two specific stories that I wanted to share that were both pretty creepy. The first one happened during one of my first outings. I was still working as a trainee, and I was required to go out with one of the more seasoned employees for the entire thing. They pretty much teamed you up with someone that was a senior for the first year, and then after that you were expected to do the work on your own. On my first survey, I was with an older gentleman named Dan. Dan had been doing this job for somewhere close to 12 or so years. Having done this for so long, there wasn't much that Dan wasn't accustomed to. He'd pretty much seen it all and knew exactly what to do in all situations. On the first outing, we had to camp out for a majority of the trip, as there weren't any nearby ranger stations for what we were doing, which was fine by me, as I've always loved camping and hiking, hence why I took the position that I did. Anyways, we were set up on our second or third night. The tents were ready to go and we were finishing up dinner. At around the time the sun had fully set, and it was pitch black, and we were about ready to call it a night. Then, I started hearing what sounded like something rustling around a bit to our south. It was like something or someone was walking a bit beyond the tree line, and I couldn't see them. This really isn't abnormal at all. When you're out in the woods, you encounter tons of wildlife, like deers, foxes, and typically you can just ignore it and continue on with your evening. I just assumed it was something like that, but when I looked over at Dan, I noticed he had his service weapon in his hand and was staring out into the trees. I asked him what was wrong, and no later than the last word exiting my mouth did we hear what sounded like a child screaming at the top of their lungs. When I say screaming, I mean like they were yelling in absolute agony. And it 100% sounded childlike. High-pitched, whiny, and followed with what almost sounded like a sobbing. I stood up, confused, and started looking over to where it had come from. Dan grabbed my arm and pulled me back down as he watched the darkness. I asked him what the hell that was, and he just looked at me and said, "I have no earthly idea, but we're going to treat it like it was just a coyote and not pay it any more attention than we have." I was beyond confused, but the stern look that he was giving me was enough to tell me that I needed to follow his lead. I nodded, and we both turned in for the night. I will say that nothing else did happen. It never got any closer or made any other sounds, and there was nothing around us in the morning, but I laid there the entire night with my firearm near my hand and ready, just in case. The second story happened closer to the end of my tenure with the company, and was probably the weirdest thing that any of us have ever found on one of our surveys. It started pretty normal. I was on the trip by myself, as I wasn't training anyone, and I was about done with the whole thing when, on one of my trips, I saw what looked like a small hole in the ground off the trails. When I say off the trails, I mean practically in the middle of nowhere in this forest. There weren't a lot of people that came out this way, honestly. We'd never had any issues with the surveys out here. I walked over to the spot where it looked like it had either been dug out or sunken in, and I noticed that something was covered in the leaves that had collected there. I moved them all out of the way, and was surprised to see what seriously looked like a manhole cover. It was round and metal, and was pretty damn heavy. I was able to lift it up and kind of roll it over to the side when I realized why it looked like the spot had sunken in. Because it had. I was looking down a concrete tunnel, into what kind of looked like a bunker that had somewhat collapsed inside. This area wasn't owned by anyone, and there was no one that should have been living here, and this bunker wasn't marked on any of the maps or the documentation. I grabbed my radio and I called it in to the station. They told me to stay there and informed me that they would call the authorities to check it out. They did, and I was pretty spot on with my guess. It was a bunker. It was a nuclear fallout shelter, to be exact. One that apparently no one ever knew existed. It was built sometime in the Cold War, most likely. Because of what it was, and the fact that no one knew what could be in the bunker, the officials had determined that they actually had to dig it up, which I completely understand. There was no way of knowing if this was a stash house for illegal goods, or anything potentially dangerous. They dug it up with an actual excavator, and they found some interesting things. First and foremost, they found the person that was living there. He was long dead, mostly just a skeleton at the point that we found him, which told me that he had probably passed away years ago and no one ever knew that he was there. It was pretty weird. They couldn't find anything that identified who he was, why he was there, or honestly how he had managed to build and hide in this bunker for so long. There wasn't anything illegal in the bunker, just a lot of canned foods and books, as well as a few photos of seemingly random landscapes. It's the weirdest thing that this guy had managed to build this bunker that long ago and fly under the radar. My thoughts are that he built it and then just never left. But this begs the question of why. Why did he decide to go underground like that? To the best of my knowledge, they never identified who he was at all, and he's basically marked as a John Doe. This was several years ago at this point, so he probably fell into the cold case files, as there wasn't any evidence of foul play, and he likely just died of natural causes. It's just that no one found him or knew he was there until the bunker had collapsed. In the end, he went off the grid, and even after death, that's where he remained. This all happened back in 2015, which wasn't that long ago, but it honestly feels like it was several decades ago. Completely off topic, but these last 3 years have kind of felt like 3 lifetimes. And remembering 2015 makes me feel seriously old, and I'm only 32 as of last month. This happened before my wife and I were married, and we were just dating, and honestly, we weren't even sure if we were going to be a permanent thing. I won't give the exact location of where I live, but we live in a northern state with a good amount of wilderness and back roads. Back roads that nowadays pretty much just lead to nowhere. I'm sure there was a time where they were important, but now it's just dirt roads that have no real destination, and you could spend way too much time on them getting lost, just kind of absorbing the scenery. Eventually you'll end up back in the main roads, or a small town, sure, but if you're not careful, you can seriously pull up into someone's backyard and get greeted with a shotgun to your face. Some of these roads were used as logging and mining delivery roads, but as time has passed, those industries have died down in our area, and the roads have all been practically reclaimed by nature. We've gone and gotten lost a few times in those areas, but there was one time that we actually found an old abandoned mine that was more or less just a cave now with the back end collapsed. On this particular day, we had actually wanted to go back out into the area with the cave. and we were thinking about getting some nature shots of the inside of said cave and the woods around it. It had been a year since we'd actually been, and we kind of had the way memorized, but at the same time, the growth had changed and made it to where things were looking a bit different. What made it worse was that it was actually starting to rain a bit, which was going to make navigating the abandoned dirt roads harder, and also make it more likely that we would end up getting stuck. We'd been driving for a while, and at that point, I had decided that we likely weren't going to find the cave, and the rain was coming down pretty hard. I then decided that we should go ahead and pull over and just wait out the storm. I turned down what looked to be a flat road without much in ways of hills or valleys, and then pulled over to the side and parked the Jeep. At first, I was pretty happy that we had found a nice flat area to park to wait it out. But then it kind of hit me. Where we live, it's not really flat, and this area kind of felt unnaturally placed, in the middle of the old mining roads. My girlfriend didn't seem to realize how strange it was, but as I was looking around, I started to kind of feel uneasy about it. To the left was pretty much just normal woods, but to the right was what looked to be an empty field. Like, purposely empty. It was as if someone had completely cleared it out and was just leaving it dead. After a while of just sitting there and talking, and resting my eyes for a few minutes because, as uneasy as I was feeling, the sound of heavy rain against the roof of your car is enough to knock almost anyone out. The rain had started to slow down, so I was more so able to see what was around. For the most part, it looked to be pretty empty, just the trees to the left and field to the right. But then I noticed what looked like an old camper near the edge of said field. When I say old, I mean old. It was beaten up, rusted, and it looked like it had been abandoned for a few years. I pointed it out to my girlfriend, and she excitedly said, "Let's go check it out. Maybe they'll know where the cave is." Yeah, she actually said that we should get out and go toward the creepy old abandoned camper or RV or whatever you want to call it, and ask if they knew where the abandoned mine was. I kind of laughed at her and mentioned that that was how horror movies started. She just kind of laughed me off and said, "Yep," and then opened the door, which meant that we were about to go check it out. As we were walking towards the RV, I was feeling a really deep sense of this is a bad idea, all wrapped up with the feeling like we were being watched. My initial thought was that maybe there was somebody in the RV and they were camping out here, but honestly, with how trashed it looked on the outside, I really didn't think someone could be living in it. We got up to it and she knocked softly on the door. After a few moments, with there being no answer, she knocked again, and I decided to kind of look around the RV because I was pretty well convinced that there was no one in it. When I got around to the side that I couldn't see from the road, I was proven correct. There was a massive hole in the side that I could see into. She yelled over that she didn't think anyone was there, and I told her that she was correct. And as I was sitting there just kind of staring into the hole, she opened the door and walked into the RV. I was genuinely surprised and asked her what the hell she was doing. She said that it was most likely abandoned and that no one was going to care. I mentioned that it could be a crime scene or that there could be a dead body in it. While that last statement was a joke, she actually responded with, "You might not be far off." I asked what she meant, and I walked around to follow behind her. In the RV was a bunch of clothing, like really old clothing, that was dirty and torn up. And some of it was stained brown, with what was either blood or something else, which is more disgusting. It got worse the more that we looked around. There was the clothing, sure, but then there were also what looked like toys lying around. There were boxes of really old food in the kitchenette area, and then when we got to the bedroom area, there was what looked to be really old handcuffs connected to a pole that was affixed to the floor. Both ends were still closed, like the person that had them on was able to slip out of them, or like they were relocked. But they were dirty and rusted over at this point. After seeing that, I was done looking around at this thing, and I told her that we should probably go. To my surprise, considering this was her idea, she actually agreed. We got out, and as soon as my feet landed on the grass, I seriously got hit with the sense of somebody was there. I looked around and I didn't see anyone, but I just knew that there was someone watching us, which scared me even more. My honest thought was that there was someone living in that RV, and that we had intruded on their home. Obviously, we just showed up when they weren't in it. I don't know how someone could have possibly been living there, but I think they were. We quickly made our way back to the Jeep and decided to just give up looking for the cave, and we seriously never went back down those old roads. Something about the RV and what was in there was too much for us. And there's literally nothing in this world that will ever make me want to go back to see if it's still there, or go anywhere near it. Nowadays, when we get that feeling that we want to go out and be one with nature, we just go to the park. So this was a collection of middle of nowhere stories. This collection, not really the stories, but the video itself, the idea, was originally put on the calendar for January, and I ran out of time for it, I think, is what happened. So I ended up pushing it off and pushing it off and pushing it off, and I put my fist down and was like, no, we're doing it in April, and it's on the calendar, and I have the stories for it, so yay! Anyway, that was the collection, Middle of Nowhere Stories. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Would love to have you stick around, as you guys know. Please also consider leaving me a comment, letting me know your thoughts, or if you have any other topics you'd like to see on the channel. There is a poll if you go to my community tab for the last video in May. Please do choose what you would like to see. Winner gets the video. The winning topic gets the video. There are no winners, as in winning people. What am I saying? Anyways, yeah, I don't know. My brain's kind of frazzled. Flustered and frazzled is flazzled, apparently. I hope you all have a beautiful day. I hope I see you on the next video. But of course, until then, my friends, sleep well.